Night in a graveyard is not the kind of darkness most people imagine. It isn't a curtain that simply falls after the sun disappears. It's heavier, more tangible, as though the weight of centuries seeps up from the soil and settles into the air. I have walked these grounds for years, long enough to know every crooked headstone, every patch of grass that grows thicker where the soil below has shifted, every tree whose roots have stretched around the coffins laid beneath. And yet, no matter how familiar the place becomes, there's something about the night watch that never feels ordinary. Perhaps it is because, unlike the day, there is no sound of footsteps from grieving visitors, no murmured prayers, no clatter of flowers being laid. There is only silence, and me, the caretaker, left to guard the resting dead. I begin each watch the same way, because ritual is what keeps the mind steady. First, I walk the perimeter fence, lantern in hand, ensuring no gaps in the iron, no lock left undone on the gate. The town pays me to keep vagrants out, though truth be told, the living rarely dare to wander here after dusk. Most fear is superstition, but superstition has power. It keeps people away, keeps me alone with the weight of the graves. After the gates are checked, I move along the pathways, my boots crunching softly over gravel, the flame of my lantern painting brief arcs of light across names etched in stone. I read them without thinking now. Dates of birth and death, whole lives reduced to 2 numbers and a dash between. Sometimes I whisper them aloud, as though by doing so I am reminding the world that the people buried here were once more than carved granite markers. The air at night carries its own scents: damp earth, moss growing along cracked stone, the faint sweetness of wilted flowers left behind earlier in the day. Sometimes I catch the metallic tang of rust from the gates or the cold odor of wet stone after rain. These details may seem unimportant, but they tether me, keep me grounded when the silence begins to feel too vast, because silence here is not emptiness. It presses against the ears, filling them until even the smallest noise, an owl's call, the scuttle of a rat across dry leaves, seems magnified, echoing far louder than it should. That silence is both comfort and curse. Comfort, because I know it means the dead are undisturbed. Curse, because sometimes it feels as though the silence itself is listening. There is a rhythm to the watch, and I cling to it. After the perimeter, I move inward, tracing the rows section by section. The newer graves are tidy, cared for, with fresh flowers still bright beneath the moonlight. Families still come to these, sitting on the grass to talk to their lost ones as though words might carry through stone and earth. But farther back, where the headstones lean and the inscriptions are faded nearly smooth, few visitors tread. That part of the cemetery belongs to me alone. I have always found a strange peace there, among names no one living remembers, where the wind whistles softly through the trees and the grass grows wild. I carry tools with me, always. A small spade strapped across my shoulder, not because I expect to dig, but because roots sometimes push stones out of place, and soil has to be leveled again. A lantern swinging from my left hand, its glass smudged by years of smoke, and in my coat pocket, a little notebook where I log any disturbances, fallen branches, toppled markers, even foxes that sometimes burrow too close. The log is my anchor, proof that what happens here can be reduced to ordinary things, explained, recorded, put away. At least that is what I tell myself. The first hours usually pass without incident. I make my rounds, breathe the chill air, listen to the steady hum of insects. But there are always moments, small and fleeting, when I feel eyes on me. Of course, I know there are none. The graves do not watch. The statues do not stir. The soil does not breathe. And yet, as I pause to rest my lantern on a marker, I sometimes catch my reflection in its glass, only to realize my reflection seems a fraction slower than me, as though it lingers, delayed. It is nonsense, I know. Tricks of the light, tricks of the tired mind. Still, I avoid staring too long. Some caretakers despise the night shift. They speak of it as punishment, of hours dragging in suffocating silence, of cold that seeps too deeply into the bones. But I have never minded it. There is a strange intimacy to being alone with the dead. They do not demand. They do not judge. They simply rest, and it is my task to make sure their rest is undisturbed. I used to think of it as a sacred duty, a quiet guardianship. But in recent years, I have begun to wonder if it is the other way around, that I am not the guardian of the dead, but that they are the ones who keep me, testing my resolve, watching from beneath the soil. That night began like any other. The air was crisp, the moon high, casting pale light across the crooked stones. My lantern's glow swayed with each step, drawing brief halos that flared and vanished against names carved long ago. I moved along the northern wall first, checking the gate, then cut across the central path, pausing to note a fallen branch in my log. My boots were damp with dew by the time I reached the older section, though I hadn't planned to linger there until later in the night. The newer graves demand more attention after all, more signs of visitors and maintenance, but something about the stillness drew me back sooner. The silence was familiar, yet sharper than usual, as if holding its breath. My routines were meant to steady me, to keep my mind tethered to the ordinary, and so I repeated them with precision. Perimeter, rose, logbook, lantern. But that night, for reasons I could not explain, I felt the ritual falter. My hand shook slightly as I turned the page in the logbook. My lantern's light seemed weaker than usual, its glow barely pushing the shadows back. And beneath all of it, a sense grew, low and insistent, that the night would not pass like the others. Something waited beyond the familiar rhythm, something that would break it. I pressed on anyway. That is what a caretaker does. When the silence grows too heavy, you walk forward. When the shadows lean too close, you lift the lantern higher. When the mind begins to wander toward impossible thoughts, you cling to the routine until dawn arrives. Yet even as I told myself this, I felt it, the certainty, quiet and cold, that the watch I began that night would not end the same way as the countless ones before. The graveyard held its breath, and I walked deeper into it, unaware that the ordinary silence I relied on was already unraveling. The old section of the graveyard has always been different, and though I have walked its narrow paths 1,000 times, it never greets me the same way twice. It sits toward the far edge of the property, where the fence bends inward, iron twisted by years of rust and storms, and the trees grow too thick, their roots cracking the ground into uneven ridges. Most of the town forgets it even exists. Families tend the newer graves, closer to the entrance, bright with flowers and polished stone. But the old section, it belongs to time itself, and to those of us who must walk it alone. On that night, the second hour of my watch had only just begun when I felt the pull toward it. Normally, I leave that section for last, because once you step into it, the silence changes. It's not the same quiet that lingers over the newer graves, not the soft hush of wind and insects. No, the old section has a silence that feels layered, built from decades of neglect and sorrow, as if the ground itself has swallowed too many voices and now holds them all, pressed down and waiting. I could feel it even from the distance, the lantern's light flickering low as though reluctant to shine on what lay ahead. The headstones there are not merely old, they are forgotten. Many lean so far that they are nearly indistinguishable from the trees beside them, their names carved into marble now eroded to ghostly scratches. Moss grows in thick carpets across their faces, and when rain comes, it pools in the indentations, distorting the letters even more. Some markers are broken entirely, toppled sideways into the dirt as though the ground refused to hold them up any longer. I've always told myself it is only weather, the natural work of erosion and time. But standing there at night, you cannot help but feel the weight of abandonment pressing against your chest. I swung the lantern higher, its glow brushing across the crooked rows. The light revealed more than stone. It revealed the gnarled symbols etched deep into some of the markers. I had noticed them before, though never enough to dwell on them. Strange curves and lines that didn't belong to any religious iconography I recognized. Not crosses, not stars, not angels, just symbols, carved by some hand long gone, and each one weathered in a way that seemed to resist the decay of everything else. The lines were still sharp, almost too sharp, as if whatever they meant refused to fade with the rest of the stone. Most caretakers avoid this section altogether unless ordered to check it. Some whisper that it's cursed, others that the ground there is unstable. I've heard them laugh about it in daylight, dismissing their own unease with jokes, but I have seen the way their laughter falters when dusk falls. They hurry their duties, never glancing toward the far corner where the trees loom thickest and the gravestones tilt like drunks frozen mid-step. I have never admitted to sharing their fear, but in truth, every time I cross into that section, my breath grows shallow and my skin prickles as though unseen eyes have settled on me. That night was no exception. I stepped into the older ground, my boots sinking into soil softer than the rest of the cemetery. It held a dampness that clung to the soles, a wet earth smell that rose stronger with each step. The lantern swung in my hand, and I noticed how its flame struggled, guttering in ways it hadn't before, though the night was still and no breeze stirred the branches overhead. I forced myself forward, telling myself it was duty, just another round, just another entry in the logbook. Yet my free hand kept brushing against the spade on my shoulder, as though holding on to the familiar weight of iron might tether me against the encroaching dread. Somewhere in the old section is a grave that predates all the rest. The town records don't even list its name anymore. The stone is so worn you can't read the date, and the earth around it has caved slightly, leaving a hollow impression as if the ground itself had sighed beneath the weight. I passed near it that night, and though I didn't pause, I could feel the shift in the air around me. The silence tightened, pulling taut, until even my own breathing seemed too loud. I heard the echo of my steps as though they belonged to someone else walking just behind me. I didn't turn. You never turn in the old section unless you want the silence to follow you home. Routine, I reminded myself. Routine is the anchor. I paused by one of the tilted stones, brushing a patch of moss away with my glove. The letters beneath were barely visible, but I could make out the faint trace of a name. Sarah, or perhaps Samuel. The rest was gone, lost to time. I scribbled in the logbook, stone eroded, leaning east. Just another note, something ordinary to tether me back. But even as I wrote, I felt the air shift again, subtle but undeniable. It was the kind of shift you notice only when you've spent years listening to silence. The insects that had been chirping faintly in the distance stopped. The breeze that had been sighing through the trees went still. The night seemed to press inward, heavy and expectant. I should have turned back then. I should have finished the round and walked toward the newer sections, where the silence still felt natural. But something deeper pushed me onward. Perhaps it was pride, perhaps stubbornness, or perhaps the old section had a way of drawing men where they shouldn't go. I moved between two rows where the stones leaned inward like crooked teeth, their symbols catching the lantern glow in unnatural patterns. The soil here was uneven, rising in little ridges, and for the first time that night I stumbled, catching myself against the edge of a marker. The stone was cold, far colder than the night air should have made it, and I jerked my hand back quickly, staring at the faint imprint it had left against my palm. I told myself to keep moving, that there was nothing unusual beyond the ordinary decay of forgotten graves. Yet even as I forced myself deeper into the section, I knew something was waiting. The silence wasn't just absence, it was the holding of a breath, the pause before something breaks. And in that pause, I realized I was no longer walking into the old section out of duty. I was being led, step by step, into a place that had been waiting far longer than I could imagine. I had walked the old section many times before, and though its silence always pressed harder than in any other part of the cemetery, the ground had always been still. But that night, as I moved deeper between the leaning stones, my lantern trembling faintly in my grip, I noticed something that stopped me cold. At first, I thought it was only a trick of the dim light, shadows thrown strangely by the uneven soil. Yet as I drew closer, the difference became undeniable. The earth at one of the older graves had been disturbed. It was subtle, almost careful. The mound wasn't collapsed like it might be after decades of erosion, nor clawed at like when foxes or stray dogs burrow too close. No, this earth was loose, its top layer freshly shifted, the soil darker than the ground around it, as though it had been turned recently. The grass above it was broken, its roots severed, not by age but by something deliberate. I froze, listening to the silence that crowded closer. My breath came too loud, and even the smallest scrape of my boot against the gravel felt like it echoed through the entire graveyard. The disturbed grave stood out in part because of the headstone that marked it. It was not as eroded as some of the others, but neither was it clear. The name was faint, letters softened into ghostly outlines, but the date was gone completely, smoothed into nothing. What struck me most was the shape of the stone itself, thin and tall, with the faint remains of symbols carved near the base. Not religious ones, not the usual marks of angels or prayers. These were angular, almost geometric, and though the moss tried to swallow them, they seemed to resist fading, etched with some purpose that had not dulled with time. I crouched low, letting the lantern dangle closer to the soil. My glove brushed the dirt, and it came away damp and fresh, the kind of dampness you only find when a spade has cut deep and unearthed what had been settled. It was recent, far too recent for a grave that should have lain untouched for decades. A chill slid across my shoulders, and for a long moment, I simply stayed there, listening to the silence, waiting for a sound that might explain it. A trespasser, perhaps, or a foolish teenager drawn by morbid curiosity. But the gates had been locked and no footprints led to the grave. The earth had been shifted from beneath, not above. I wanted to dismiss the thought as absurd, the product of a tired mind too long steeped in silence. But as I studied the mound, I saw the way it sloped unnaturally, the way the soil seemed to bulge outward instead of sink. It was as though something below had pressed against the coffin, forcing the dirt upward, restless, unsettled. The lantern shook in my hand, its flame fluttering dangerously low, casting shadows across the carved stone. The symbols seemed to ripple in the shifting glow, as though mocking me, as though they had been waiting for someone to notice. Instinct told me to walk away, to write "no disturbance" in the logbook and pretend I had never seen it. But curiosity is a cruel thing, sharper than fear, and in that moment it rooted me to the spot. I pressed the end of my spade against the soil, testing it. It sank more easily than it should have, the ground giving way as though it had no will to resist. The sound was soft, muffled, but in the stillness of the old section, it struck me like a shout. The soil was too loose, too deliberate. Someone, or something, had shifted it. The silence deepened as I straightened. No insects, no wind. The trees stood still, their branches unmoving, as though the entire graveyard was holding its breath, watching. My pulse pounded in my ears, but I forced myself to step back, to circle the grave slowly, noting every detail in my mind. The stone leaned slightly forward, its base cracked where roots had pushed against it, but the soil was what drew my eyes again and again. It was not the collapse of age. It was a disturbance, recent and undeniable. I thought of the stories whispered among caretakers, the ones spoken half in jest, but with eyes that betrayed their fear. Graves that shifted in the night, earth that seemed to move as though breathing, coffins that creaked long after they should have rotted away. I had always dismissed them as stories, ways for lonely men to give shape to their unease. But standing there, lantern trembling, I could not laugh. The soil was wrong, the grave was wrong, and I was standing too close to something that did not want to be seen. I pulled my notebook from my coat, my hand unsteady as I flipped to the next page. The pencil hovered over the paper, but I could not bring myself to write the truth. Instead, I scribbled something plain, something safe. Stone cracked, soil uneven. A lie of omission, perhaps, but one I could stomach. Yet even as I wrote, the lantern flame sputtered, dimming until for a moment I thought it would go out completely. In that faint second of near darkness, I thought I saw the soil move, not settling, not collapsing, but shifting upward, as though a breath had been taken beneath it. My chest tightened. I forced myself to step back. The logbook pressed against my side, the lantern raised high again. The soil lay still now, silent and unmoving, but I knew what I had seen, and I knew this grave was no longer just another line in the old section, forgotten and silent. It was disturbed. It was waiting. I turned, intending to walk away, to leave the old section and return only at dawn when the light of the sun could make sense of what the lantern could not. But even as I stepped back onto the path, I felt it. The silence had shifted again, deeper, heavier. The grave behind me no longer felt like stone and soil. It felt like something alive, watching me leave, patient as the earth that held it. Silence in a graveyard is not unusual. It is, in fact, expected. After all, people come to cemeteries for quiet reflection, for peace among the dead. Even caretakers grow used to the long stretches of stillness broken only by wind, insects, or the occasional cry of a night bird. But what descended over me that night, as I stood staring at the disturbed grave, was a silence of a different kind. It was not the natural quiet of night, but a silence so complete, so deliberate, that it felt as though something unseen had reached into the air and pressed a hand against every sound until none dared emerge. The first thing I noticed was the absence of the wind. Just minutes before, I had heard it faintly, threading through the tall grass and rustling the branches that crowned the old section. Now it had vanished. The trees stood rigid, their limbs frozen, their leaves still as stone. Then came the realization that the insects had stopped. No crickets chirping, no faint buzzing of night beetles, not even the distant croak of a frog from the marshland beyond the cemetery wall. Everything had gone mute, and in that muteness, my own breath grew thunderous in my ears. I shifted the lantern higher, its glow flickering across the crooked headstones, and felt as though the flame itself strained to keep burning in the weight of that silence. Normally, light provides comfort, but here it seemed frail, a trembling defiance against something vast and watchful. I had worked the cemetery long enough to know when the quiet was ordinary and when it was not. This silence was unnatural. It had intention. I began to walk, slowly, my boots crunching against gravel in deliberate steps, each sound a fragile intrusion. The disturbed grave remained behind me, but I could feel it even when I wasn't looking, the way one feels eyes on their back in an empty hallway. I thought of turning, just to prove to myself that the mound of earth hadn't shifted again, but I didn't. My instinct screamed against it, whispering that to look back would be to invite something I was not ready to face. Instead, I kept moving forward, deeper into the rows of leaning stones, and tried to steady my breathing. The silence followed. Not just followed, it grew. Every step I took seemed to pull me further into it, like wading into deeper water where sound could no longer travel. My heartbeat thudded in my chest, a living drum that grew louder only because everything else refused to exist. Even the lantern's faint hiss of burning oil seemed to vanish, leaving me surrounded by nothing but the echo of myself. It was not just the absence of noise. It was a suffocating stillness that carried with it the weight of presence, as though the air itself had become aware. I paused near an especially old row of stones, the inscriptions nearly gone. The moss glowed faintly in the lantern's light, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw the faintest shimmer across the symbols carved at the base of one of the markers. My eyes strained, and in that straining, I realized the silence had begun to shape itself in my mind. It wasn't just emptiness, it was expectation, as though something waited, held in the breathless pause, testing how long I would linger before I broke. A sound finally did come, but it wasn't the return of crickets or wind. It was me. My throat had gone dry, and as I swallowed, the faint click of it rang too loud in my ears, like a door slamming in a quiet house. I froze instantly, staring into the dark beyond the circle of lantern glow, half convinced that the noise would draw something out of the shadows. Nothing came. The silence absorbed it, swallowed it whole, and returned to pressing in from all sides. I forced myself to move again, though slower now, each step hesitant, my eyes darting from stone to stone. I wanted desperately to hear something natural again, anything. A breeze, a chirp, even the creak of a tree limb, but nothing returned. The graveyard was still, locked in a suspended moment that stretched far too long. It was like standing on the edge of a cliff in pitch black, waiting for a stone you'd drop to hit the bottom. But the sound never comes. The waiting becomes unbearable, and in that waiting, dread takes root. The disturbed grave called to me even as I tried to move away from it. The silence radiated from that direction, thickening the air until even the lantern seemed weaker the closer I turned back toward it. And though I had every intention of continuing the patrol, of escaping this oppressive hush, my feet faltered, and before I realized it, I had turned halfway around. I could not see the grave from where I stood, not clearly, but I knew it was there. The soil, loose and recent, the stone, leaning forward with its strange symbols. The silence had not spread from nowhere. It had begun there, and though I could not prove it, I knew that grave was the reason the cemetery had gone mute. I stood frozen in that realization, my grip tightening around the lantern, my other hand finding the spade I carried. The silence had become something alive now, a force that wasn't merely absence, but presence, an awareness that filled the night air and pressed into my chest. I realized, with a cold certainty, that the silence itself was watching me, and worse, it was waiting for me to notice what came next. I had told myself to keep walking, to let the silence pass like a strange cloud and wait until the familiar sounds of the night returned. But something in me resisted, tugging me back toward the grave I had tried to leave behind. My body obeyed instinctively, betraying the words of reason repeating in my mind. And so, almost against my own will, I found myself standing once again before the disturbed mound of earth. Only this time I didn't need the lantern to see what was wrong. The grave itself seemed to breathe. At first it was subtle, so subtle I thought it was the flicker of my lantern making the ground appear to shift. I crouched, lowering the light closer, watching the way the shadows stretched across the soil. but no trick of light could explain it. The dirt itself was moving, slowly, almost imperceptibly, but undeniably alive. It swelled upward, the way Earth does when water seeps beneath it, except there had been no rain for days. And the shape of the bulge wasn't random. It pressed outward in the center of the grave, exactly where the coffin should have been lying still, locked beneath decades of earth. I felt the spade in my hand grow heavier, though I knew its weight hadn't changed. My arms tightened around the handle, sweat dampening my gloves despite the night air being cool. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to leave the grave as it was, to walk away and never speak of what I had seen. But fear has a strange way of binding you to the very thing you dread. I couldn't move. My eyes remained fixed on that restless soil, on the way it seemed to push against the world above it, as though the earth itself was too thin a veil to contain what pressed from below. The silence that had swallowed the graveyard deepened in that moment. I realized I was holding my breath, but even when I let it out in a shaky exhale, the air seemed unwilling to carry the sound. The lantern hissed faintly, straining to stay alive against whatever weight pressed on the night, and the glow it cast showed me something that turned my stomach. The soil was not just swelling, it was shifting. Small cracks opened in the mound, fine lines that stretched outward like veins, releasing faint trickles of darker soil from beneath. The grave was loosening itself. I stepped closer, though I hated myself for it, lowering the lantern directly above the mound. The soil moved again, and this time the movement was clearer. It was not the random settling of earth, nor the shifting caused by rot or collapse. It was deliberate. Something was pushing from below, slow and steady, pressing upward in defiance of the weight above it. The thought that something was down there clawed through me, though the dates etched faintly into the leaning stone insisted the burial had been more than 50 years ago. Whatever lay below should have long since rotted into silence. My grip on the spade tightened until my knuckles ached. I told myself I would prod the soil, just once, to prove it was only my imagination. But before I could, the ground responded on its own. The mound dipped suddenly, as though something beneath it shifted position. A faint plume of dust rose into the cold night air, curling upward and vanishing almost immediately. I staggered back, heart hammering, the lantern shaking so violently I feared the flame would snuff out. I tried to steady my breath, but another movement stopped me. The soil heaved again, this time more forcefully, and for the briefest moment I thought I saw the faint outline of something beneath, a shape pressed against the dirt, not fully formed, but undeniable in its intent to rise. It was gone almost immediately, swallowed by the darkness, but the impression remained in my mind, carved there as sharply as the symbols on the stone. The silence broke, not with sound, but with the vibration beneath my boots. It was faint, like the trembling of a rail before a train, but enough to travel through my legs and lodge in my bones. The ground beneath me was alive, restless, and the grave was its center. I staggered back another step, finally lifting the spade as though it might defend me, though I knew it was nothing more than a false comfort. What use is steel against the earth itself? I wanted to believe that this was simply the collapse of an old coffin, wood giving way after decades of strain, soil sinking to fill the hollow left behind. That explanation would have been natural, comforting even. But the collapse of a coffin pulls the ground inward, creates hollows and depressions. What I saw was the opposite. The soil was not falling, it was rising. Something below was refusing to stay buried, pressing upward against the world that had sealed it away. The lantern flame flickered violently as I stared, and in that trembling light I saw the mound shift once more, this time accompanied by the faintest sound. A soft crack, muffled by earth, like wood splitting. My heart lurched. The coffin. The sound had come from the coffin. Something inside had moved. Something inside had broken the stillness of 50 years. I staggered back further now, my boots scraping against stone, the silence pressing harder against my chest until I thought I would suffocate on it. The soil stilled once more, lying deceptively calm, but I knew it wasn't over. The earth had shown its intent. It had shifted, pressed, and groaned beneath the weight of years. It was only a matter of time before it did so again. And I realized with a sinking dread that I was the only witness, the only one standing between the restless grave and the oblivious world beyond the cemetery gates. I should have walked away then, but I didn't. Something in me, a terrible pull I couldn't explain, kept me rooted there. eyes locked on the grave, waiting. Waiting for the soil to shift again, waiting for the coffin to speak through its splintered wood, waiting for what I already knew was coming. The soil had quieted, but I knew better than to trust the stillness. It wasn't the calm of something resolved, it was the pause of something waiting. I kept my eyes locked on the mound, every muscle taut, breath shallow, as if the very act of breathing too loud might stir whatever pressed beneath. My grip on the spade had grown so tight my hands ached, but letting go of it felt impossible. It was more than a tool now. It was the last fragile line of separation between myself and the earth that seemed determined to reveal something it was never meant to show. I should have left, I told myself again and again, each repetition weaker, each one drowned by the pull of dread that tethered me there. The lantern flickered in my other hand, the small flame barely managing to cast its trembling glow over the disturbed grave. It was then that I thought I heard it again, the faintest crack, deep and muffled, like wood straining against a pressure it had held for far too long. My chest tightened. The coffin had not been silent after all. The grave had more to say. Driven by something between fear and compulsion, I raised the spade and lowered it toward the soil. Not to dig, not yet, but to test. I pressed the flat of the blade against the mound, slowly, cautiously, as though prodding a sleeping animal that might wake at the lightest touch. The steel sank only slightly, the earth giving under its weight in a way that felt wrong. The soil should have been compact after so many years, settled into dense stillness. Instead, it yielded too easily, as if hollow beneath the surface. I swallowed hard, and with a trembling motion, I lifted the spade and let the edge fall lightly against the dirt again. This time I didn't press. I struck softly, just once, like knocking on a door you don't want anyone to open. The sound that rose from the earth froze me in place. It wasn't the dull thud of packed soil or the muted crunch of decayed wood. It was a hollow, resonant sound, one that echoed faintly before dying in the silence. The breath caught in my throat. Hollow. As if the coffin beneath me wasn't filled as it should be. As if what lay below was not lying still, pressed against wood and earth, but empty, or worse, moving. I struck again, harder this time, desperate to prove it had been a trick of my imagination. The spade rang with the same dreadful sound, a hollow echo, too deep, too empty, like tapping the lid of a chest whose contents had slipped away. The silence of the graveyard pressed closer around me, suffocating, amplifying that sound in my head until it became more than noise. It became meaning. Whatever lay beneath that soil was not resting. The grave was not full, not settled. It was waiting. I forced myself to crouch lower, lantern closer to the ground, its flame bending in the night air as though recoiling from the mound. My ear tilted toward the soil, just enough to catch the faint vibrations rising through the spade. There was something else now, beneath the hollowness. A subtle rhythm I could almost mistake for coincidence. But it wasn't. It was too steady, too intentional. It came in soft intervals, separated by stretches of unbearable quiet, and each one was sharper than the last. Tap, pause, tap, as though something deep beneath the earth was answering my strikes in kind. I staggered back, nearly dropping the lantern, heart pounding so violently I thought it would burst free of my ribs. My eyes darted across the stones, to the trees, to the sky, searching for some ordinary explanation. But the cemetery gave me nothing. No wind, no crickets, no sign of life beyond my own panicked breaths. The silence was absolute, except for that hollow resonance still echoing in my bones. My mind raced. Perhaps the coffin had rotted, leaving cavities that collapsed when pressed. Perhaps vermin had burrowed through, leaving gaps beneath the soil. I clung to those possibilities like a drowning man clings to driftwood, but no vermin knocks back. No cavity answers when you strike. The lantern flame sputtered, casting shadows that seemed to ripple across the uneven soil. I could swear I saw the mound quiver in response, just faintly, as though acknowledging my fear. The spade trembled in my hand, no longer a comfort but a weight dragging me further into the realization that I was not alone here. Not truly. The hollow sound had spoken, and it had spoken back. I wanted to run, to flee the cemetery entirely, but my legs rooted themselves as though bound by the very silence around me. Every nerve screamed to leave, yet I remained, because some terrible part of me needed to know what else the soil would reveal. I lifted the spade once more, raised it high above my shoulder, and slammed it into the mound with a force that shook through my arms. The sound that rose was deafening in the quiet, a booming, cavernous echo that resonated far deeper than any coffin had a right to. And then, for the briefest instant, another sound slipped through, a faint scrape from below, like wood dragged across wood. My blood ran cold. Something moved beneath the earth. The hollow sound was not the mark of emptiness. It was the sign of something shifting, restless, preparing to rise. The echo of that hollow strike still reverberated in my bones long after the vibration faded from the steel of the spade. I stood frozen, unwilling to lower the tool again, unwilling to test what I already dreaded to be true. My chest rose and fell in shallow bursts, every breath thin and ragged, like the air itself resisted entering my lungs. Then came the silence, heavier now, as though the hollow sound had carried something out of the earth with it, something that settled into the night and weighed it down. It was in that silence that I first noticed the smell. It crept into the air subtly, almost too faint to name, like a whisper carried on the edge of windless night. At first, I thought it was my imagination, a phantom odor conjured by fear. But the longer I stood, the sharper it became, until I could no longer deny its presence. It was acrid, metallic, carrying the sting of rusted iron mixed with something sour, the unmistakable bite of decomposition that had no right to escape a grave sealed for half a century. I lifted my free hand instinctively to cover my nose, though the smell seemed to seep past flesh and cloth, embedding itself deeper, inside me, where no barrier could block it. I lowered the lantern toward the mound again, though every part of me wanted to turn it away. The soil remained still, but its color seemed darker now, as though dampened from beneath. I couldn't tell if it was only the trembling of the lantern flame casting illusions, or if something inside the grave had truly begun to bleed into the earth around it. My stomach turned at the thought, and yet I couldn't stop staring. Then the sound began. It was faint at first, no louder than the settling of old wood, a brittle crack like a branch snapping underfoot. I told myself it was only the coffin giving way, buckling beneath the weight of the years. That would have been natural, expected even. But the sound didn't stop. One crack became another, then another, sharp and deliberate, separated by pauses that felt too measured to be random. It was not the chaotic collapse of decay. It was rhythm. Something down there was pushing, breaking, demanding release. The spade trembled in my grip. I pressed it into the soil again, not striking this time, but steadying myself as the cracks multiplied, each one sending a shiver up my spine. The ground beneath the blade vibrated faintly, alive with motion it should never have held. And then came a new sound, softer, but far worse. A groan. Low, muffled, as if buried in layers of wood and earth, yet human in its resonance. My blood froze. The air left my lungs in a ragged gasp, and the lantern slipped in my other hand, its flame sputtering dangerously as it swung. I caught it clumsily, nearly dropping it into the soil, and when the light steadied again, I wished it hadn't. The mound quivered, just faintly, just enough for the shadows to ripple across its uneven surface. I staggered back a step, boots scraping against stone, but the grave did not relent. Another crack sounded from below, followed by that same groan, stretched longer this time, unmistakably alive in its cadence. I whispered something then, maybe a prayer, maybe a curse I don't even remember. All I knew was that the grave had begun to speak, and I was its unwilling audience. The smell grew stronger, acrid and suffocating, as if the earth itself was exhaling something it had held too long. I could taste it now, metallic on my tongue, thick in the back of my throat. My stomach heaved, but I forced it down, eyes locked on the soil that shifted again, as though something pressed against it from below. I wanted to run. Every muscle screamed at me to flee, to abandon my lantern, my spade, my duty, and never set foot in that cursed corner of the cemetery again. But fear had me chained as tightly as the rusted locks I had seen on old crypt doors. I could not move. I could not breathe properly. All I could do was listen as the grave betrayed itself further. The cracks grew sharper, faster, overlapping now like splintering wood under a great strain. My mind conjured the image of the coffin below, its boards bending, snapping, giving way as something pressed against them with unnatural strength. And each time I thought it could grow no worse, the groan returned, louder now, rising through the fractures in the earth like smoke seeping through cracks in a door. I staggered back another step, but the lantern's glow followed me, stretching shadows across the mound. In that trembling light, I thought I saw the faintest shift of color beneath the soil, a darker patch, moist and glistening, rising to the surface. I clenched my jaw, forcing myself not to gag. This was not natural seepage. This was not the slow erosion of time. This was fresh, insistent, something forcing its way upward. The spade clattered as I let it drop, unable to hold its weight any longer. The metallic ring echoed far too loudly in the suffocating silence, and for an instant, everything stopped. The groans ceased. The cracks fell quiet. Even the soil seemed to still itself. I stood frozen, heart pounding, sweat running cold down my back, staring at the mound in disbelief. Then came the final confirmation, the first undeniable sign that what lay beneath was not content to rest. The soil swelled upward suddenly, sharply, as though something struck from below, and with it came a sound that froze every drop of blood in my body. A faint, rasping breath, not the sigh of settling earth, not the whistle of wind through trees. A breath, wet, labored, human. I stumbled backward in terror, nearly toppling over the uneven ground, my lantern jerking wildly in my hand. The light streaked across headstones, caught the edges of weathered inscriptions, and then snapped back to the mound, which now quivered as though alive. The acrid stench rolled thicker, choking, filling the air with the taste of rot and rust and something older still, something that did not belong in the world of the living. My heart thundered in my ears, drowning out every thought but one. I was no longer standing before a grave. I was standing before something that refused to remain one. The breath that seeped through the earth had hollowed me out as surely as if it had passed through my chest itself, leaving me stunned, emptied, unable to command my body to move. I clutched the lantern with a hand slick with sweat, its handle digging painfully into my skin, the flame within flickering as though it, too, feared what now pressed against the boundaries of this grave. The soil no longer held its composure. It quivered, rose in uneven tremors, then sank again, like some unseen thing shifting its weight below, testing the thin barrier that still confined it. I told myself that what I saw could not be real, that I was exhausted, that my mind had turned traitor, weaving shapes from shadows and breath from silence. But the senses betray only when they are asked to invent. Here, they needed only to observe, and what they delivered to me was undeniable. The mound bulged suddenly, sending a small trickle of dirt cascading down its side. I stumbled back. 1, 2, 3 paces, my boots slipping against wet earth, but I couldn't look away. Another bulge followed, stronger this time, the soil cracking slightly, as though something beneath had thrust against it with violent impatience. My heart slammed hard in my chest, blood surging in my ears, but even as my instincts screamed for retreat, I found myself frozen to the spot. The old section of the cemetery was vast, but at that moment it felt impossibly small, shrunken down to this single grave and the dark sky pressing heavy above it. Then the lantern caught it, not a trick of light, not some tortured illusion of flame and fear. No, it was there, solid and undeniable, a shape pressed against the loosened soil, faint but distinct. At first it was little more than a vague distortion, a darker patch within darkness itself, like a shadow that had no rightful source. Then it gathered form, a line like the curve of a shoulder, an angle that might have been a bent arm straining upward, and worst of all, the sense that its head, or what should have been its head, tilted just enough that I felt it was looking directly at me. My throat clenched tight. I could not speak, could not cry out, could barely even breathe. The soil shifted again, rolling downward as the shadow pressed closer, closer to the surface. For a single gut-wrenching instant I thought it would break through entirely, rise from the grave to join me in the air we shared. I nearly dropped the lantern, my grip faltering as I staggered backward, but just as suddenly as it had risen, the presence seemed to falter, its shape dissolving slightly back into the soil, and yet it had left something behind, not movement this time, but sound. It began as a faint whisper, the kind you might mistake for the hiss of grass stirred by wind, if there had been wind, but there was none. The air was dead, unmoving. The whisper grew, layered, as if 2 voices overlapped and then 3, until it became a hushed chorus seeping up through the dirt. I could not understand the words. They were too muffled, too distorted, But I knew with every fiber of my being that they were words, language from lips that should have rotted away decades ago. I pressed my free hand hard against my ear, desperate to shut the noise out, but it made no difference. The whispers bypassed flesh and bone. They spoke inside me, sliding along the ridges of my skull, filling spaces no sound should occupy. My knees threatened to buckle. I wanted to scream, to release the terror clawing at my chest, but all that came out was a ragged gasp, shallow and broken. The soil quivered violently, collapsing inward before surging upward again in a wave that sent clumps scattering down its sides. In the jittering light of the lantern, the shadow regained its form, clearer now, unmistakable in its intent. Arms, shoulders, a head bowed as though straining forward, and though its features remained blurred by soil and darkness, I felt with sick certainty that its eyes were open. I could not see them, but I felt them burn into me, searing through the trembling veil of dirt that still barely restrained them. Then the groan came again, not the wooden groan of a coffin fracturing, but a sound alive with breath, stretched and aching, rising from beneath and escaping into the night. It was louder than before, so close now that I swore I felt its vibration in my own lungs, as though we shared the same air. The acrid stench grew unbearable, thick and metallic, choking the last fragments of reason from me. The lantern flame flared once, then shrank to a thin, quivering line, its light bending in terror. I staggered back, my heel catching against a crooked headstone, nearly sending me sprawling. For a moment I thought I had broken the spell, put enough distance between myself and the grave to reclaim control. But then, impossibly, the soil shifted one last time, and the shadow rose higher than before, its indistinct form pushing through the surface just enough to spill loose earth across the ground. It leaned forward, or seemed to, and in that instant, I knew with certainty that it had seen me. I couldn't stay. The whispers clawed at my mind. The groan rattled my chest, and that shape straining toward freedom promised nothing but horror. Every instinct I had left roared for flight, to abandon the grave, the lantern, the very cemetery itself. My hand trembled violently around the lantern handle, the light within sputtering in rhythm with my thundering pulse. I took one final step back, eyes locked on the mound that seemed to pulse with its own dreadful heartbeat, and I realized with absolute terror that whatever lay beneath the soil had never let go of life entirely. It had only been waiting. I do not remember deciding to move. My body acted before my mind could argue, legs trembling beneath me, yet finding the strength to retreat one stumbling step at a time, then another, dragging me away from the mound that no longer seemed like earth at all, but like something alive, pulsing, eager to birth a nightmare into the world above. The lantern swung violently in my hand, throwing erratic shadows across the crooked stones, stretching them tall and monstrous, until it seemed the whole graveyard leaned inward, conspiring with the presence that pressed from beneath the soil. Each step backward was a betrayal of the duty I had sworn to uphold as caretaker, but instinct had risen louder than vows, louder even than the whispers that still clawed at my skull. I needed distance, I needed escape, but leaving was not so simple. The whispers followed, their cadence altering with each desperate step I took, as though mocking my retreat, as though they knew they had driven me to surrender. They grew sharper, clearer, layering over one another until they resembled words I almost understood, syllables rising and falling like the chant of a congregation long buried yet still relentless in its devotion. I pressed my palm hard against my ear, but it made no difference. The voices swelled not around me, but inside me, seeping into marrow and memory alike. My knees threatened to buckle, but fear propelled me, an engine stronger than exhaustion or despair. The soil shuddered one final time behind me, and though I refused to turn, I felt the shift reverberate through the ground beneath my boots. It was as though the grave exhaled, a breath of air thick with the stench of rust and age and something fouler still, the odor rising around me until it filled my lungs, my throat, even the sting in my eyes. I gagged, nearly dropping the lantern, but clutched it tighter, whispering fragments of prayers I hadn't spoken in years, words that faltered and stumbled from my lips, with none of the faith they once carried. Still, I prayed, because words were all I had left to hurl against whatever demanded release from the soil. I dared a glance backward as my steps carried me farther from the mound, and what I saw was worse than anything my imagination had conjured. The earth still quivered faintly, not collapsing but shifting with a rhythm too precise, too intentional, as though something had pressed against the coffin lid in steady pulses. The lantern's glow painted the mound in trembling gold, and for an instant, I thought I saw the outline of a hand imprint itself faintly in the loose soil before fading as though the weight had withdrawn. My breath stilled, my heart seized. That was enough. I could bear no more. I turned sharply, boots grinding against gravel, and fled between the rows of ancient stones. The whispers surged in volume as if furious at my retreat, as though distance alone could not sever their hold on me. They clawed and scraped within my mind, a choir of unseen throats rising in protest, and I stumbled blindly through the dark paths, my lantern flaring wildly with each panicked step. My chest burned, my breath ragged, the cold air shredding through my throat as I ran. I abandoned the spade where it had fallen, abandoned the mound that had shifted, abandoned the role of caretaker entirely in that moment. Shadows closed in on every side, stretched by the lantern's frantic glow, until I no longer recognized the paths I had walked 1,000 times before. Each crooked stone looked the same, each iron gate in the distance blurred by tears in my eyes and the weight of terror clawing at my back. I could not tell if the whispers were growing louder because they pursued me or because they had rooted too deep inside to be shaken free. My boots slipped in wet soil, sending me crashing to one knee. The lantern jerking forward so violently, I nearly extinguished the flame. I scrambled to my feet again, mud streaking my trousers, heart slamming against my ribs like a prisoner against iron bars. At last, the newer section of the cemetery came into view. The rows straighter here, the headstones cleaner, the grass more carefully kept. It should have brought relief, but I felt none. The weight of that presence clung to me, invisible but undeniable, as though unseen fingers brushed against the nape of my neck with every step. I stumbled through the iron archway that marked the division between the old and new grounds, nearly collapsing against the post. Only then did the whispers soften, not vanishing entirely but fading like an echo carried back down into the earth from which it had risen. My breath came in sobs, sharp and uneven, my chest heaving with exhaustion and dread. I did not stop walking until I reached the caretaker's lodge at the edge of the cemetery. My hands trembled so violently I nearly dropped the key twice before forcing it into the lock, the lantern swaying in my other hand until the flame dimmed to a weak glow. When the door finally gave way, I stumbled inside, slamming it shut behind me, bolting it with shaking fingers. The silence within was deafening, but it was different from the silence outside. This was shelter, however fragile, and I clung to it with every fragment of will left to me. The lantern's flame guttered out at last, leaving me in darkness, but I did not dare strike a match. I sat in the chair by the window, staring out toward the rows of stones blurred by night, waiting for movement, waiting for the mound to heave upward in defiance of its prison. My body shook with exhaustion, my skin clammy with cold sweat, but sleep would not come. Not while those whispers still lingered faintly in my ears, not while the stench of that exhaled grave still clung to my clothes. Hours stretched into eternity, and only when the first gray hint of dawn crept across the horizon did I feel the weight lift. The air stirred again, faint wind brushing against the window pane, the world slowly resuming the rhythm it had abandoned in the night. I had survived, but survival felt hollow. I had not conquered anything. I had only fled. When the sun finally breached the horizon, its light spilling weakly across the cemetery, I dared to believe the night had passed without further incident. But deep inside, beneath the shallow relief, one thought gnawed at me relentlessly. The soil had not collapsed. The grave had not surrendered. Whatever lay beneath was still there, waiting, straining, biding its time. And I, the caretaker sworn to guard this place, had turned my back and run. When the morning finally claimed the graveyard and the gray mist lifted into pale bands of sunlight, I felt no triumph in the survival of the night, only a fragile, uneasy reprieve, as though the earth itself had merely chosen to release me back into the world rather than keep me pressed beneath it. I sat in the lodge for a long while, my back rigid against the wooden chair, eyes fixed on the cemetery grounds that stretched outward in crooked rows of stone, my mind gnawed by the memory of what I had seen, what I had heard. I had fled, That much was undeniable. Abandoned my tools, abandoned my post, abandoned the role I had sworn to carry without hesitation. And yet, even as shame pricked at me like thorns, I could not muster regret. For the first time in my years as caretaker, I had come to know a truth more pressing than duty, that not all graves are meant to be watched, not all silences are meant to be broken, and not every shadow is content to remain underground. When the hour came to log the events of the shift, I took up the pen with hands still trembling faintly from exhaustion. The ledger, an ordinary book filled with ordinary entries of maintenance and inspection, lay open to its empty line. My eyes traced back over the neat columns of previous nights, each one marked with tidy precision. Gates secured, no disturbances. Wind damage repaired on northern fence. Family visited lot 12. Each line an unbroken ritual of order and routine. And then came my turn. I stared at the page until the ink in my pen threatened to dry. I thought of writing the truth, that the soil had shifted in unnatural rhythm, that whispers had poured like smoke from beneath the earth, that something had risen against the coffin lid in a refusal older than death itself. I thought of scrawling it all down, not to warn others, but to prove to myself that it had not been a fever dream conjured by fatigue. But the words would not come. To write it was to invite it into permanence, to etch into history what I desperately hoped would remain a shadow of memory. Instead, I lowered the pen and wrote what I had written countless nights before. Nothing unusual. A simple lie, perhaps the simplest I have ever told, but one that shielded me from the unbearable weight of truth. The page closed with a soft sigh, and the ledger swallowed the night whole, leaving no trace of what had passed. Yet the silence that followed did not feel like relief. It felt like complicity, like I had conspired with the grave itself to bury the memory alongside its restless occupant. Even as the sun climbed higher, casting sharp light across the tombstones and drying the dew that had clung to the grass, I could not escape the thought that somewhere beneath the old section of ground, beneath cracked marble and eroded earth, something still stirred. The world above had resumed its rhythms. The birds sang, the breeze whispered through the trees, the living prepared their flowers and prayers, but the world below had not returned to stillness. No amount of earth could suffocate what pressed against its confines. No prayer could seal it away. No caretaker's retreat could undo its awakening. I had glimpsed it, heard it, felt it as surely as I felt my own breath, and though daylight dulled the terror, it did nothing to erase the certainty. In quiet moments, when I sat in the lodge and the cemetery stretched silent beyond the window, I found my thoughts drawn back to that mound, to the handprint that seemed to form in the soil, to the whispers that had not been carried by wind, but by will. I wondered if death itself had been cheated, if what lay beneath had never surrendered to the stillness that claims us all. And I wondered, too, whether caretakers before me had known, whether they had also turned their backs and written nothing unusual into the logbooks that lined the shelves, leaving behind the illusion of order while carrying the truth in silence to their own graves. There is a saying among those who tend cemeteries, that the dead demand dignity. It is why we sweep the paths, repair the fences, polish the stones, keep the gates locked against those who would intrude. We honor not the living but the departed, for in their rest we glimpse our own eventual stillness. Yet that night shattered the saying into fragments I can never mend. For if dignity lies in silence, then what of the whispers that claw through soil? If dignity lies in repose, then what of the hands that press against coffin lids as though straining for release? Perhaps some graves do not accept dignity. Perhaps some graves never let go of what they contain, no matter how carefully we bury them. I tell myself even now that I will not return to that mound. My duties take me near the old section often enough, but I avoid the row where the earth had quivered, where the air had thickened into a breath not my own. I find excuses, trees that need trimming, stones that need tending elsewhere, and though no one notices, I know the truth. It is not cowardice, not exactly, but survival. To stand again at that grave is to risk awakening what little calm remains. And so I let it be, let it rest in its unease, trusting that soil and silence are stronger than curiosity. But in the darkest hours, when the cemetery sleeps and the world outside my window forgets itself in slumber, I sometimes feel the echo of that whisper return. It hums low in the marrow of my bones, not loud enough to rattle, but steady enough to remind me. And in those hours I remember the sight of the mound shifting, the smell of rust and decay pressed into the air, the faint outline of a hand against the soil. I remember that I fled, that I wrote nothing unusual, that I chose silence over truth, and I wonder whether silence is enough, or whether the grave still waits for someone braver, or more foolish, to step closer and break the earth again. So I keep my watch, as caretakers do, sweeping paths, oiling gates, trimming the grass that grows stubbornly around stones no one visits anymore. But deep down, I know the truth that no logbook, no ritual, no duty can conceal. Some graves never let go of what's inside, and when I walk past them, I bow my head, not in prayer but in acknowledgement, as if to whisper back to the soil, I know you are there, I know you are waiting, and I will not disturb you again.